Kuzar K57 is a crank lift used for lifting equipment up in the air. The nice thing about the K57 is that it has a very high weight capacity. The downside of having that high weight capacity is that there is a slight bit of extra complexity in operating it. So again, Kuzar K57, when we crank it up, we can lift 1,000 pounds. Once it's up and locked, it can hold 2,600 pounds. So it can be used in a tower mode. But again, because of that extra high weight capacity compared to other lifts, there are a couple little gotchas that we have to be sure we understand in order to operate this Kuzar. So let me show you the locking pins on the side of the Kuzar. In order to achieve the high weight capacity, all of these pins have to be locked. When they're pointing straight across here, that's the locking position. At all times, all pins should be locked unless you're cranking the lift up or down, in which case one pin at a time can be unlocked. So this is the locked position, this is the lift position, and to come down, to come in, you hold it out. By holding it out, that allows you to lower the lift. So again, locked, raised, or lowering. But at all times when in use, all of the pins need to be in the locked position. The lift has 4 legs. All 4 legs have to be in use. The long leg goes in the front. If you think about the tipping moment of a lift, all the weight is on the front, so the long legs go in the front to keep it from tipping. And the first thing we do is unscrew the leg here so that it can be removed. Take the leg out of the storage position and place it into the receiver. Now, a leg has not been inserted until you have pulled on it to make sure it's locked. So I'll show you a leg that is not locked. When I pull on this, it comes right out because that leg was not locked. Put it in, make sure that this is in the locked position, and then we tug on the leg. Always tug the leg. Until you have tugged the leg, you have not inserted the leg. So then we do that with all 4 legs all the way around. All 4 legs inserted, tug on it to make sure it is locked. Kuzars have a high load capacity, so they have extra hardware to give it extra strength. That's this outrigger right here. Simply remove the pin. Now, this pin immediately gets inserted into this hole to make this outrigger a rigid support. Without the pin in the hole, the outrigger can simply slide in and out and offers no additional strength. By pinning this hole, the outrigger becomes a rigid piece of hardware. The outrigger is then attached at the top to the lift with another pin. Remove the pin. The outrigger gets immediately pinned to make it a rigid support. Once the outriggers have been installed, we work all the way around the lift to crank down each leg. This provides support as well as making sure the lift is nice and level. We want to crank the leg at least until the leg stops wobbling around. When it's no longer wobbling around, we know that it's taking weight. You'll notice that once all 4 outriggers have weight, they're not flopping around and wobbly anymore. You'll also see that the wheels are just slightly off the ground. We'll then look at the bubble level to make sure the bubble is perfectly centered. So this bubble is not currently centered. We need to crank up on these 2 legs. Once the bubble is perfectly centered, we'll lower the center support foot to take the flexing movement out of the center of the lift. The support forks here are what support our load. Remove the pin, turn the fork 90 degrees so that the fork is angled slightly up. And repin it. Again, checking that it is rigidly attached. Before adding weight to the lift, we want to double check that all of our support structure is properly configured and set up. So that's making sure that we have the pins and the outriggers, making sure all 4 feet are down tight to the ground, and making sure that the bubble level is perfectly centered. Always double check before adding weight to the lift. So to overcome the friction inside the lift as it goes up and down, the lift has to have at least a 55-pound minimum load. So if you're just cranking it up and down to learn how to use it, you got to be sure to put some extra weight on it. So we'll do that with some sandbags here to have a 55-pound minimum load. Once your load has been added to the forks, we'll start to crank the lift up. Remember, all of the pins need to stay locked at all times except for when you're actively cranking up or cranking down. In order to bring the first mast section up, we'll unlock it and place it in the up position. With the lock in the up position, we can start cranking, and you'll see the lock will push out as the carriage approaches, and then snap back into position when it's locked. Once it's snapped back into position, we then lock this mast and move on to the very next mast. We move it to the up position so that it can be cranked up. Again, you'll see that the lock will push out and spring back into place as the mast extends. As we approach the end of the mast section, we have to start paying attention. When we get to the end, we don't want to crank against this pin at the end. When we get to the final locking position, we'll pause and move on to the next mast. So I'm paying attention as we crank this out. As soon as the mast stops moving smoothly, we stop cranking and move this to the locked position. We may need to crank up or down slightly for this to drop back into its locking hole. Once this one is locked, we can move on to the next mast position by unlocking this pin to the up position and starting to crank. Once we've arrived at our final height, we'll move the pin to the locked position and crank up or down until it snaps into the closest locking hole. At this point, all of our pins are now locked and the lift is ready to be used. Always check your bubble level about halfway up to make sure the lift is still plumb and straight. That's also a good opportunity to kick all the outriggers and make sure they're nice and firm to the ground. Sometimes an outrigger can be floating in the air, especially when it's an uneven ground. So kicking these to make sure they have weight in them goes a long way. Before walking away from a lift, again, you always double check that everything is locked and secure, including all of your green locking pins should all be in the locking position, as well as all of your pins secure with their safety pins. Bringing the lift in is the opposite process. We start by holding the pin out in the lowered position. Treat this like a dead man switch so that if you were to let go or the cable were to break, the pin would snap into the next locking hole. Hold this out with your fingers in the locking position as you lower the lift. The lift should come in smoothly while holding the pin out in the lowering position. I'm keeping my eye on the top of the mast so that when this mast section lands, I can move on immediately to the next pin. The pins are in line, I can move to the next pin and continue lowering the mast. The last mast section often takes extra weight, to come in smoothly because it doesn't have the weight of the entire lift. That can continue to be lowered, but again, before we walk away from the lift, we make sure all pins are in their locking position. Pins should always be locked except when actively cranking them up or down.